Picture a 16th century European spy, right, standing on the deck of this swaying wooden galleon.
Oh, wow. Okay, setting the scene.
Yeah, and they're furiously sketching the jagged coastline of a Caribbean bay.
Right.
But the thing is, this person isn't trying to capture the romantic beauty of the sunset.
No, not at all.
I mean, they're carefully measuring the depth of the water. They're calculating exactly where a cannonball might strike a fortress wall.
Exactly. It's not about expression.
Right. That sketch, it isn't art. It's classified military intelligence.
It's pure data collection. And when we talk about the history of visual representation in Cuba, that is exactly where the story begins.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. It doesn't start in a quiet, sunlit studio with some misunderstood genius. It starts with foreign military cartographers mapping out potential targets.
And that completely flips how we usually think about art, doesn't it?
Oh, completely.
We love the romantic image of the lone genius battling a blank canvas. But today, we're going to shatter that illusion. So welcome to this deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Our source material today is this really fascinating text called A Visual Chronicle of Cuban Painting. But we're coming at this with a very specific mission.
A very structured mission, yeah.
Right. We are going to map the actual infrastructure, like the schools, the state funding, the commercial logistics that literally created the Cuban visual identity.
And we're tracing it from those earliest military maps all the way up to a very hard stop in the year 2012.
Yes. 2012 is our absolute boundary today. But before we get into it, a quick disclaimer for you listening.
Right. This is important.
We're looking at a span of history that obviously intersects with some incredibly intense, politically charged eras.
Very charged.
But our approach today is strictly sociological and structural. We are, completely neutralizing the political rhetoric to impartially report on the humanistic milestones.
Exactly. We aren't endorsing any political viewpoints.
No, not at all.
We just want to understand how shifting institutions, whether it's colonial military commands or a centralized public management model, how they actually change the way paint is applied to a canvas.
Okay, let's unpack this. Going back to that spy on the ship.
Let's do it.
Unlike regions that had the Maya or the Quechua, the island of Cuba didn't have a massive pre-existing indigenous pictorial legacy to draw from, right?
No, it didn't. The geography dictated everything.
So the first time color and formal visual representation hit the island, it was strictly utilitarian.
Right. You have these European map makers, like Sebastian Münster in 1540.
Wow, 1540.
Yeah, and he's putting the island on a map purely for navigation. Holland, France, England. They needed to understand the bays and defense systems for their empires.
It's logistics.
Pure logistics, so they hired engravers. There's this famous set of colored engravings by Dominique Serres, who's a Frenchman working for the English.
Huh?
And he created these highly detailed, step-by-step visual records of the English capturing Havana in 1762.
I mean, I look at those engravings, and it really feels like the 18th century equivalent of early drone footage.
That is a perfect way to describe it.
Or like satellite imagery, It's just functional technology. It's someone saying, here's the terrain, here are the fortifications.
Exactly. It's data.
But the fascinating part is how that functional imagery eventually morphed into something deeply personal and, really status-driven.
Yeah, and that shift happens when the economy fundamentally changes.
Right.
Because as the 18th century progresses, you see the rise of a very wealthy Creole aristocracy, largely fueled by a plantation economy.
So there's suddenly a lot of money.
A lot of money. And when a society accumulates wealth like that, the physical spaces change. People start building massive, ornate homes.
Like the Casa de la Barapia in Havana.
Exactly. And once you have these grand interior spaces, well, you suddenly need something beautiful to hang on the walls.
The demand for interior decoration.
Right.
They wanted to curate their public image. I mean, it's the 18th century version of managing a social media profile.
That's exactly what it is.
You want people to walk into your parlor and instantly know how important you are.
And this demand creates the first real professional infrastructure for painters. A perfect example of this is Vicente Escobar.
Oh, right.
He didn't paint maps or military conquests. He devoted himself entirely to high society portraits. He was known as a physiognomist.
Yeah, I actually had to look that word up.
It's a great word.
It really is.
Right.
A physiognomist isn't just someone who paints a face. They're supposed to be capturing the exact physical features, but also the internal character, like the essence of the person.
Precisely. And Escobar became the first fashionable, highly recognized painter on the island.
Because he catered directly to the elite.
Exactly. To their need to broadcast their status, he painted the captains general, the wealthy plantation owners.
Right.
His work wasn't really about pushing artistic boundaries, you know. It was about fulfilling a logistical need for a wealthy patron.
Along with Nicolas de la Escalera, right? I read he was self-taught.
Yes, Escalera is fascinating. He painted what we'd call the Baroque cathedral of the Cuban countryside. But again, it's early patronage.
Which makes total sense for a society that's just starting to cultivate its own domestic visual culture.
Absolutely.
But, isolated pockets of wealthy aristocrats paying for flattering portraits, that doesn't really give you a national style.
No, it doesn't.
So how do we get from Vicente Escobar painting the elite to a standardized, recognizable school of art?
Well, for that, you need formal pedagogical infrastructure.
Okay.
You need a school. And that foundational milestone arrives in 1818.
1818, got it.
Yeah, when Bishop Espada and the Quartermaster General Alejandro Ramirez established the San Alejandro Academy of Drawing and Painting.
And to put that in perspective for you listening, San Alejandro is one of the very few colonial institutions in the Americas that actually survived all the way to the present day.
It's incredible longevity.
It really is. But to run it back then, they brought in a French artist named Juan Baptiste Vermeer. And man, from the sources, it sounds like Vermeer was an absolute stickler for the rules.
Oh, he absolutely was. He was brought in to instill strict neoclassic academicism.
Which means what, exactly?
Well, neoclassicism is highly disciplined. It relies on perfect proportions, strict mathematical perspective, and classical heroic themes.
So no abstract splatters.
Right. It's the exact opposite of messy emotional expression. Vermeer established a rigid baseline of technical perfection.
Okay.
He famously painted these massive formal murals at El Templete in Havana, depicting civil and religious ceremonies with, honestly, photographic stiffness.
Wait, let me stop you there.
Sure.
If Vermeer is enforcing this top-down, rigid, mathematically perfect neoclassicism, doesn't that make everything look like a boring government building?
Wow.
Like, what about the local flavor? Because while the Academy is painting stiff portraits of bishops, there's an entirely different visual explosion happening out in the commercial sector.
Ah, you're referring to the costumbrista movement and commercial lithography.
Right. You have artists like Eduardo Laplante.
Yeah.
He's drawing incredibly detailed, gritty lithographs of sugar mills. I mean, he's showing the steam engines, the industrial mechanics, the actual workers.
It's very documentary.
And Victor Patricio de Landaluz showing everyday people. Plus, you have the global explosion of Cuban cigars, the habanos.
Right, in places like Key West and Tampa.
Exactly. The cigar industry needed lithographic labels and bands to guarantee authenticity, and that commercial art became this wild, unique blend of allegorical figures and folkloric motifs.
It was very distinct.
It feels so much more vibrant than what San Alejandro was teaching. So didn't the rigid academy stifle that grassroots commercial energy?
It's a natural assumption. But the historical mechanics actually work in reverse.
Wait, really? How so?
An institution like San Alejandro doesn't necessarily crush local flavor.
Yeah.
What it does is standardize the tools of expression. It provides the architectural scaffolding.
Okay, I think I see where you're going with this.
By the late 19th century, San Alejandro had built such a robust educational system that its students possessed an incredibly high level of technical mastery. And what do you do once you master the rules?
You figure out how to break them.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Because of that academic baseline, San Alejandro students began traveling to Paris and New York.
Oh, wow.
They were exposed to global movements like Impressionism. Consider Leopoldo Romagnano.
Right. The sources mentioned him.
He absorbed those impressionist techniques, the blurry, light-focused, emotion-driven brushstrokes that completely defied neoclassicism.
The total opposite of Vermeer?
Yes, and he brought them back to Cuba. He actually ended up teaching at San Alejandro for 50 years.
50 years?
Yeah, using the Academy's own infrastructure to introduce radical new techniques to generations of students.
So the institution funded the very people who would eventually evolve it.
Exactly.
That is fascinating, and here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Because if Romagnac cracked the door open for breaking the rules, the next generation completely kicked it down.
They absolutely did.
The 1920s through the 1950s saw the emergence of a highly organized, independent resistance against that very same academic structure.
We refer to this era as the birth of La Vanguardia, or the Vanguard.
And what I love about the Vanguard is that they didn't just complain about the Academy. I mean, they built their own alternative infrastructure.
Right, they were proactive.
They rallied around an independent publication called the Revista des Avants. These artists had gone to Paris, but they weren't looking at Impressionism anymore.
No, they had moved on.
They were studying Cubism, Surrealism, and Expressionism.
They wanted to dismantle the strict photographic realism taught at the Academy. They demanded greater individual freedom.
And you can see this vividly in the work of Amelia Peláez.
Oh, her work is incredible.
It is. Instead of painting a perfectly proportioned, realistic portrait, she painted Cuban flora and colonial architecture using these thick, heavy black lines.
And pure, luminous colors.
Right. It almost looks like shattered stained glass. It was a cubist interpretation of her own culture.
Or take Wifredo Lam.
Oh, man, Lam.
I mean, his masterpiece, La Jungla the Jungle, is just stunning.
If you listening have never seen it, imagine the fractured geometric shapes of a Picasso painting, but fused entirely with Afro-Antillean totemic elements.
That's a great description.
He painted these towering, elongated masks blending into sugarcane stalks. It was tribal, it was magical, but it was executed with the highest level of European modernism.
What the Vanguard did was prove that visual identity didn't have to be dictated by a centralized academy.
Right.
And that momentum of independent resistance only fractured and specialized further. By the 1950s, the artistic community experienced a literal schism over the philosophy of painting itself.
The showdown between the abstract and the concrete.
Exactly.
You have a collective calling themselves the Abstract 11 artists like Guido Linas and Hugo Consuegra.
Right, and they viewed painting as a direct psychological release.
Yeah, no discernible shapes, just pure feeling translated into color and form on the canvas. And then on the opposing side, you had the Concrete 10, who focused entirely on optical essences and strict geometry.
It was an era of intense, grassroots intellectual debate.
It reminds me of like open source software developers deciding that they are fed up with a massive legacy tech monopoly.
Oh, I love that analogy.
Right. San Alejandro was the legacy tech. So these artists bypassed it entirely. They formed their own collectives. They pooled their resources to rent alternative exhibition spaces.
They shared techniques directly with each other.
They crowdsourced their own decentralized infrastructure.
Which brings up a critical historical tension.
Okay, what's that?
What happens when a decentralized, independent artistic infrastructure clashes with the formal political infrastructure of the state?
Oh, this is the 1954 event.
Yes, because in 1953, the Batista administration attempted to organize a massive cultural exhibition.
A Hispano-American biennial in Havana, right?
Exactly, heavily funded and coordinated with Francisco Franco's Spain.
But the independent artists saw right through that. They recognized the state was trying to use their artwork as a shiny, legitimizing political instrument.
It wasn't about celebrating the art at all.
No, it was about the state trying to look cultured and legitimate on the world stage.
And the artists responded with total structural disruption.
Which is just amazing.
The Abstract 11 and their allies organized an anti-Bienal de la Habana at a local venue called the Lyceum in 1954.
Wow.
Sociologically speaking, this was a massive event. It was a complete organized boycott of the state's attempt to co-opt cultural output for political validation.
They essentially crashed the state's operating system by refusing to log in.
That's exactly what they did.
They proved that the independent infrastructure held the real cultural power. But, that dynamic completely flip-flops just a few years later.
Yes, it does.
Because following 1959, those fierce, independent, open-source networks are suddenly absorbed into a massive, centralized public management model.
Right. The post-1959 state administration completely overhauled the logistical and pedagogical infrastructure of the country.
And remember, we're keeping this strictly structural.
Exactly. The new official cultural directive was essentially this: artistic production is granted formal freedom, but that freedom operates strictly within the logistical bounds of the state's centralized management model.
So the state became the ultimate patron, the ultimate gallery owner, and the ultimate school principal all rolled into one.
That's a good way to put it.
The scale of this institutional expansion is hard to wrap your head around. I mean, before this, you had San Alejandro and a handful of independent galleries in Havana.
Right.
But after 1959, the state creates the Ministry of Culture, the Writers and Artists Union, and the Instituto Superior de Arte de ISA.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the most profound sociological shift here was the expansion of pedagogical access.
Meaning education wasn't just for the city kids anymore.
Exactly. Art education was no longer isolated to the urban elite in Havana. The national education system integrated the formal study of art from primary school all the way up to university levels across the entire country.
Wow.
A child in a rural agricultural province now had a formalized pathway to access professional artistic training.
So what does this actually do to the paint on the canvas?
That's the real question.
Because there's a paradox here. We have this massive, top-down, centralized state management system. Usually when a state controls the funding and the galleries, you expect the art to turn into, well, rigid bureaucratic propaganda.
You expect endless paintings of heroic tractors.
Exactly. But when you look at the actual output from the late 20th century, it is incredibly intimate and highly subjective.
And that is the fascinating byproduct of this specific institutional architecture.
How so?
The system produced artists who were technically brilliant because the ISA and the academies were rigorously training them, but psychologically the artists turned inward.
Oh, interesting.
When the state manages the public square, artists often build complex internal landscapes to express their individuality.
They retreated into their own minds.
Yes.
You see this so clearly in someone like Roberto Fabello. His work from this era isn't painting state achievements.
No, not at all.
It's filled with subjective hallucinations, strange metaphorical creatures, and quiet commentaries on power.
Or Cosme Proenza, who utilized surrealist subtleties to paint these dreamlike, almost medieval or Renaissance-style surroundings.
Right, they feel completely detached from modern reality.
Exactly. And Manuel Mendive, who dove deep into the thematic wealth of Cuba's African roots, blending myth and nature.
Or Zaida del Rio painting these wildly fluid, hallucinated enchantments of bird women.
It's incredible work.
The centralized infrastructure gave them the world-class technical tools, but the artists used those tools to map their own psychological interiors.
Which brings us to the temporal boundary of our source material.
Right, the hard stop.
The historical and sociological data we are analyzing today hits a definitive, absolute stop in the year 2012.
That's our historical wall. We can look back from 2012 to the 16th century, but we cannot project any trends past that date based on this chronicle.
Exactly. For the purposes of understanding the institutional architecture, 2012 provides a stable cap on our data set.
Everything is contained.
Right. Everything from the colonial military maps to the nationwide expansion of the ISA is contained within this bounded framework.
Looking back over that framework, the journey is just incredible. I mean, we started with those 16th century European spies drawing utilitarian maps.
Visuals dictated entirely by foreign military intelligence needs.
Right. Then we moved to the 18th century, where wealthy aristocrats demanded portraits to curate their social status.
Which led to the creation of San Alejandro.
An academy that tried to enforce strict mathematical neoclassicism, but inadvertently gave artists the technical vocabulary to rebel.
And that rebellion created the Vanguard,
a decentralized network of artists who bypassed state institutions entirely to experiment with cubism and abstraction.
Eventually boycotting the state entirely at the 1954 anti-biennial.
Yes. And finally, we watched those independent networks get absorbed into the post-1959 centralized state infrastructure,
which expanded technical training nationwide.
And inadvertently birthed an era of deeply introspective, surrealistic art, ending our map firmly in 2012.
It's a profound structural evolution.
When you really think about it, this completely changes how you look at the world around you.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the visual culture you consume every single day, whether it's a classic oil painting in a museum, a corporate logo on a billboard, or, the sleek interface of an app on your phone, none of it is created in a vacuum.
All structural.
It is always shaped by the logistics behind it. The institutions that teach the creators, the systems that fund them, and the galleries or app stores that distribute their work, they all dictate what the final product looks like.
Art is the visible surface of an invisible infrastructure.
I love that. Which leaves us with a pretty massive question to think about.
Let's hear it.
We started this whole deep dive by comparing those early colonial maps to military drone footage, visual data controlled by empires.
Right.
And we've seen how art evolves based on who controls the infrastructure, whether it's aristocrats, strict academies, or a centralized state ministry.
It's always managed by someone.
Exactly. So what happens to a culture's visual identity when the tools of creation and distribution become completely decentralized?
Oh, that's a huge question.
Right. In our global digital age, where anyone can publish anything from a smartphone, the old institutional gatekeepers are vanishing. When that heavy infrastructure finally breaks down, who actually decides what a masterpiece looks like?
That is fascinating.
Something to chew on next time you're scrolling through your feed.